I also want to introduce Jung-Kim, the Korean Cultural Center, Los Angeles General Manager. Eun-jung, hi. Now, we will begin our lecture. The first lecture today is the political development and economic growth of South Korea by Dr. Jennifer Jung-Kim. Dr. Jennifer Jung-Kim teaches courses on the history and cultures of Korea and East Asia in the University California, Los Angeles, Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. The International and Area Studies program and the Honors Collegium program. She is also affiliated with the Food Studies program. She enjoys designing new courses and incorporating, reacting to the past historical role-playing games into them. In 2021, she was selected for the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, and she works closely with K-12 educators to incorporate Korea into their curricula. Dr. Jung-Kim, you may start lecture.
Very much for your welcome and for your invitation to speak with the educators today. I'm going to go to share screen now. Okay. Okay, can you see it? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, let me go to slideshow. Okay, so we're talking about the political development and economic growth of South Korea. So we're talking about post World War II, post 1945. So just a few things about Korea, and by Korea I generally mean South Korea. So it's been called the miracle on the Han because of its economic success. And we're going to today look at how it became this economic success and how it achieved democratization. So as of last year, South Korea was the 14th largest economy in the world, although the last few years, there's been a lot of fluctuation and it's actually been up higher, and depending on currency exchange rates, et cetera, it does change. So currently it's considered the 47th in democratization, but it's also been a few years ago much higher. In fact, a few years ago, South Korea ranked much higher than the United States in democratization. But all of this really happened through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, as I'll explain. So looking at the 20th century, it was a huge century for South Korea. So the Joseon Kingdom ended in 1910, and Korea was under Japanese colonialism until 1945. Now, at this time, there's no North Korea, South Korea, there's just one Korea. And after World War II, their independence were jointly occupied by the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. And the Soviets withdrew in 1947 and the Americans in 1948. And then, as I'm sure you know, the Korean War broke out in 1950. So this was a civil war, but also it was an international war and a proxy war. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, I have an asterisk after 1953 because technically the war never ended. The war is still going on, which for those of you who know BTS will know that all but Jin are currently fulfilling their service. Well, one of them in community service, but they're doing that because the two Koreas are still at war, and all able-bodied males fulfill their military service. So After the Korean War, we see this the Cold War politics, and South Korea put its emphasis on economic development, and democratization happened in 1987. Second, to move on. Okay, so one way to see this development in South Korea is to look at Cheonggyecheon, which may look familiar to you even if you haven't been to Korea, because it's featured in many dramas and movies. So it's just over 5 miles long, and originally it was a stream. And in 1958, with economic development, they covered it over with concrete. And then they built the elevated highway over it. And then in 2003, then Mayor Lee Myung-bak said they're going to restore Cheonggyecheon. And I'll show you pictures. So the original stream isn't flowing right now. They actually cemented over the original stream, but they pump water from the Han River, and then it flows back out to the Han River. And it cost at the time about $250 million, and it's still a model for many other urban redevelopment plans. Look at that. Okay, so here it is before it was developed. So it is 5 miles long. It's not the same throughout. This is where some of the most dilapidated homes were. You can see that they're like stilt homes. This is where the pylons are going up. You see here, these aren't the stilt houses on this side, but a lot of people were living in really makeshift homes. And then after the elevated roadway, it looked like this, running through downtown Seoul. And then here you can see the side-by-side of what it looked like before with the elevated roadway when they were dismantling it, and now as an urban park. So it looks like this. It's really beautiful, and many people go there, especially in the warm months. And whoops. Also, I don't know if you can see here, but right here, you'll see that there are a lot of ways to cross, but some of them are, just kind of like they made it out of concrete, but they're like kind of stones that are there, so people can walk over, but you do have to be careful. It's not all fully enclosed with handrails and stuff. Okay, now here's a timeline. I'm not going to go over all of it, but you can see by glancing through how the GNI, gross national income, has changed per capita. Today, the nominal GDP is at about 33,000. You can see some of the other milestones here. And in terms of democratization, from the establishment of the Republic of Korea in the south and Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, it also followed a long process. And this is specifically for South Korea. So starting with the student revolution in 1960, followed by a coup, and Park Chung-hee being assassinated in 1979, another coup that same year, the Gwangju uprising, and we see the process by which, and I won't go through all of it, but the reason I put the Seoul Olympics here, by the way, in 1988, is that the IOC awarding the Seoul Olympic or the Olympics to Seoul was that the world's attention would be on Korea, and that they would be democratizing to meet expectations. I'll talk a little bit more about this separately. So, okay, so 1945, Korea is divided into the joint occupation, and the two separate Koreas are established. Before this, there weren't really two separate Koreas. It was one Korea for many centuries, in fact, over 1,000 years. So Syngman Rhee was the first president of South Korea. He was elected, as you can see here, 4 times. And his presidency is called the First Republic because that was the first constitution. And this is also when the Korean War happened. And in terms of the economy, it's import substitution because instead of importing everything, South Korea was just trying to make things on its own to meet domestic consumption. Syngman Rhee also promulgated the national security law, which is still on the books today, and it gave a very vague and broad definition of what it means to go against the government. So basically, he used the national security law to even go after his opponents in presidential elections, because if they criticized him, then they were breaking the national security law. After the fourth election in 1960, there was a massive student revolution. He resigned and lived out his life in exile in Hawaii. And this led to a very brief period of democracy in South Korea. And if you look at the picture of him on the right, you might be like, wait, his wife looks a little different. She's actually, she was Austrian, Francesca Rhee. She was his second wife, but the Korea's first lady was a foreigner. Okay. And then before the Korean War, there's a lot going on. So North Korean troops who had helped in the Chinese Revolution, and when the Chinese Revolution ended in 1949, they came back and they're very kind of antsy. So there's a lot of border skirmishes happening between the North and the South all through 1949. And then in summer of 1950, North Korean troops invade on the far west and then move east. And in North Korea, they like to say that South Korea invaded first, but generally it's historically accurate that North Korea invaded. Okay, and then the Korean War timeline. I won't go over all of this. I'm going to show you the map because it's easier to explain. So when the Korean War broke out on June 25th, 1950, you see the division, North invaded, and the South Korean troops retreat all the way to what's called the Busan perimeter, really a small corner of Southeast Korea. And then after the UN forces led by MacArthur land at Incheon, you see the arrow on the left, they're able to retake all of the South and they go into the North and they take a big part of the North as well. However, at that point, the Chinese troops enter as reciprocity for North Koreans helping out in the Chinese Civil War. And then things ended with the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, which is a little bit different than the 38th parallel, but basically things kind of ended at a status quo despite a huge amount of bloodshed and loss of lives on many sides. So Seoul, after the Korean War, was really devastated, but of course not just Seoul, the North as well. And so we can look at this Korean War as a civil war in that it was between the two Koreas. It was also a proxy war between the two world powers. It was an international war if we look at how many countries were involved and the outcomes. We don't have really clear numbers, but as you can see, a huge number dead, injured, and uprooted. Many families were divided at this point across the DMZ as sometimes family members split up and as they headed south. Also turned out that some families weren't actually divided across the DMZ, but were all, let's say, living in South Korea, but didn't know that. And there's also, for many people, this sense of longing for unity. And then we entered into the Cold War period. Okay, so this is the student uprising 1960 that led to Syngman Rhee, his wife Francesca, and their dog leaving for exile in Hawaii. And so people got a sense of democracy at this point. They wrote a whole new constitution, so this is called the Second Republic, and they decided to give the real political power to the prime minister, and the president would be more of a figurehead. And so for the first time, they also allowed direct elections for governors and mayor instead of these being appointed positions. But some people said that the party and the government were weak, that the economy wasn't strong enough. And that's a picture of Chang Myeon, the prime minister. He had lived in the United States, and so he also had a Western name, John Chang. And so given this instability, Park Chung-hee, a general, staged a coup in 1961. The prime minister asked the US for assistance, but the US declined to intervene because their emphasis was on anti-communism, and Park Chung-hee seemed to be very strong in that way. So he wasn't elected president until 1963. So for 2 years, he ruled through a junta that had a very innocuous name called the Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. And so Park Chung-hee in 1963 stepped down from his military post and ran as a civilian for president at the urging of John F. Kennedy. And he won in 63, 67, and 71. But he staged kind of his own self-coup in 72 and wrote a whole new constitution that basically made him president for life. So that's the Third Republic and the Fourth Republic for the third and fourth constitutions. There is Park Chung-hee, his coup, another picture there. Okay, so his focus was really on economic development. And this also was in line with the United States policy of trying to build strong allies against communism by bolstering economic development. So a lot of the economic development was engineered from the government, from the central government through these 5-year plans. And in 1965, South Korea and Japan normalized relations. So after the end of the colonial period, they didn't have official diplomatic ties, but in 65, they had a treaty, and this brought in $800 million in aid and loans from Japan to South Korea, which was really instrumental in giving South Korea a big boost. The following year, South Korea and the United States signed something called the Brown Memorandum that brought in South Korean soldiers and supplies and companies providing logistical support to the Vietnam War. And this brought in about $1 billion. So many South Korean soldiers went to fight in the Vietnam War, and the United States paid the South Korean government the same combat pay as they paid their own soldiers. So this didn't go all to the soldiers. The South Korean government was able to pay the Korean soldiers less than what they had gotten. But also really significant is that South Korean companies and individuals also provided a lot of support. So companies like Korean Air got their start at this time. Okay, so this is the signing of the 1965 Normalization Treaty between South Korea and Japan. This is a picture from the Vietnam War. And so while Park Chung-hee is in power from 61 to 79, the focus really is, instead of import substitution, it's export-oriented industrialization. So he used the money from the Normalization Treaty and really had some pretty big ideas, like to start POSCO, which is Pohang Iron and Steel Company, shipbuilding at a time where South Korea is really just a fledgling economy. So these were incredibly big visions. Also, a lot of areas were designated as special economic zones where they do a lot of industrialization and factory building. But he also focused on the countryside through this Hemaul or New Village movement, where the focus was on building up infrastructure in the countryside. But this also got him a lot of votes from people, from rural voters. And everything is part of this Cold War politics, where anti-communism really is the main ideology. Okay, so here we have a picture from the Pyeonghwa, or the Peace Market, where it's lots of small-scale factories, many of them involved in clothing, textile, and so we see people sewing here. This is POSCO, Pohang Iron and Steel, which is one of the largest steel makers in the world. And this is Hyundai Shipbuilding. And what they did in Pohang is the steel actually comes right off the POSCO assembly line, right onto the shipbuilding yard. So it's not a lot of transporting the materials. Here we see Park Chung-hee overseeing construction in the countryside. And Park Chung-hee was assassinated by the head of his own KCCLA in 1979 There was a brief attempt at democratization. However, there's a new coup in 1980, which is met, I'm sorry, actually the coup was not May 1980. That's my mistake. I'll fix that. It was in December 1979. But what happened in 1980 is the Gwangju democratization movement, or also known as the Gwangju uprising, which was put down, however, led to a stronger democratization effort for the remainder of the 1980s. And under Chun Doo-hwan is more economic development through high-tech industries, and also Korean construction companies going overseas to build large-scale projects. Okay, so I need to fix that date. Okay. So in May of 1980, starts out with a very small protest at Cheonnam National University in the city of Gwangju. And Chun Doo-hwan said this is a North Korean communist plot. So they sent in paratroopers that wreaked havoc on civilians, and citizens retaliated by taking over the armory, getting weapons, and taking their city back. And they asked the United States for help, but the US declined again on the basis of they thought a strong anti-communist leader was what South Korea needed. And this led to anti-Americanism among the protesters, radicalization in the 1980s. So as citizens commandeered the city, the military is circling, has a blockade around the city, and then they go back in and put down the protesters. So if you're interested in learning more about this, A Taxi Driver is a really good movie. It's available in many of the streaming networks, and it shows also the poor dad from Parasite, if you're familiar with that film. So this is Gwangju, the center square, Gwangju, in May of 1980. And democratization was finally achieved in 1987. So this happened because students, intellectuals, workers, middle class, women's groups, religious groups, they really all came together in demanding democratization. This is also right before the '88 Seoul Olympics, so there's a lot of attention on Korea and a push for more civil rights. So in 1987, they have the first direct elections for president since 1972. Actually, technically since 1971. 1972 is when Park Chung-hee had his coup in office to write a whole new constitution. So here we have some scenes of student protesters. This is a political rally for one of the 4 presidential candidates in the '87 election. You can see how many people turned out because people were really excited by the idea of direct elections. However, with 4 candidates, they only had, nobody won the majority, but a person with the most votes won. So 1987, 4 candidates, No Tae-woo ended up winning. And we have to look at democratization not as something that really happens overnight, but as a process. And this is right before the Seoul Olympics in 1988. And then afterwards, Kim Young-sam became president. He had been one of the 4 candidates in 1987. South Korea joined the OECD, and I'm sorry, that should be trials, not trails. I'll fix that as well. The 2 previous presidents, Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo, were put on trial for their role in the 1979 coup. And at the end of Kim Young-sam's presidency came the Asian financial crisis, also known in Korea as the IMF crisis. So, and Kim Dae-jung became president in '98, winning the '97 election. And this was significant and another big marker in the democratization movement because he had been a long-time opposition leader. He'd been arrested many times, sentenced to death, but it was the first time an opposition leader won, and also the first time a candidate from the Jeolla province won. So this really marked a full democratization for South Korea. Coming at the end of the IMF crisis, his initial focus was on economic recovery, but then he turned to the Sunshine Policy of engaging with North Korea, had a summit with his North Korean counterpart, and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2000. So there he is, Kim Dae-jung on the right, Kim Jong on the left. And then the next president is Roh Moo-hyun. He was a self-educated human rights lawyer. And during his presidency, he was actually impeached for illegal electioneering and incompetence. This was overturned. In Korea, the sitting president is not supposed to campaign for his party, which is what he had done. And then there was a second summit with North Korea. And after his presidency ended in 2008, committed suicide amidst allegations that people said were wrongful allegations by the new administration. So there he is on the left, and you also see him sitting with a much weaker Kim Jong-il. Okay. And then Lee Myung-bak became president. So after a decade of liberal presidents, Lee Myung-bak's election marked a swing back to conservatism. And he had been a former business person, a former member of the National Assembly, former mayor of Seoul, and he's credited with a lot of fast recovery from the worldwide recession. But we also see during this time, there were a lot of protests over things like beef, US beef imports, but it really wasn't about beef. I'll show you a picture. Tensions with North Korea. So we see him sitting in Cheonggyecheon, which I showed you earlier. On the lower right is a candlelight protest when he said they would resume the import of US beef after the whole mad cow disease thing. People protested, but it wasn't really just about the beef. It was also about South Korea being less beholden to the United States. Okay, and then came Park Geun-hye, the first female president in South Korea. She's also from the Conservative Party, and we saw further tensions with North Korea. The Kaesong Industrial Complex closed down. You may have also remembered from a decade ago, the Sewol ferry disaster where many middle schoolers died in the when the ferry capsized. Also, she was impeached because her longtime friend had been found to advise her on government matters without security clearance, but also that her friend had coerced a lot of donations from corporations, basically into a slush fund. So she was impeached, removed, and imprisoned. She's since then been pardoned. This was a part of the memorial for the victims of the Sewol ferry disaster. You might be able to see many of them. That's actually, they have school photos, but they're just very young. So here, this shows kind of what happened to many of the former presidents, how many of them have been jailed, sentenced, or in the case of Roh Moo-hyun, committed suicide. Okay. So Moon Jae-in was the previous president before this one, and he had 3 summits with North Korea. He also had kind of complex relations with the US in that he was from the Liberal Party, but he also had kind of negotiated, or rather what's the word? I'll just say negotiated with the US to provide support to them. So this is when THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, was deployed. They bought more US military equipment, but also really tense relations with both China and Japan. However, he's also, on the other hand, credited with how South Korea successfully handled COVID in the early pandemic. So here he is with Kim Jong-un, North Korea. Also on the lower right, you see him with then President Donald Trump. So some pictures of the pandemic here. Students didn't spend a year plus at home like many students in the United States did. Here you see individual barriers, people wearing masks. When they did testing, they had like these booths set up. You see people disinfecting this market. And the current president is Yoon Suk-yeol. He was elected in 2022, and he won by less than 1% of the total vote. And he made lots of campaign promises that, well, the Blue House, he did move out of the Blue House. It's now kind of a public area people can visit. He also said he was going to abolish the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, which has not yet happened. So here, if you see this big age and gender divide, so young men under 30 were mostly voted for Yoon Suk-yeol. And then when you get to the older folks, 60 and up, you also see that male or female, they tended to vote for Yoon. However, you see that aside from the older folks, women, young women, middle-aged, I'm sorry, wait. So, this is, yeah, so women tended to vote more for Lee Jae-myung, the Democratic Party candidate who did not win. Okay. So today, Korea's economic strengths are in cars. You may have a Hyundai or a Kia, both are Korean brands. Shipbuilding, Korea is one of the largest shipbuilders in the world. They also make a lot of the chips that go into our products, a lot of electronics, and of course, you're probably familiar with K-pop. Earlier on in the 1980s, there was a lot of Korean companies going and doing construction abroad. 1990s, it was more high tech. 2000s on, the things that I was just talking about. So here's a Hyundai vehicle. South Korean shipbuilding is also moving toward more clean energy ships. So that's something that South Korea is at the forefront of. And in terms of popular culture, probably familiar with things like BTS, or perhaps you watch Squid Game. The second season is coming out, Parasite the film, and there's really a lot of soft power. So whether it's entertainment or other things. This is BTS, Squid Game, Parasite. On the right, this is not Parasite, but this Yoon Ya-jung, who won an Oscar for her supporting role in Minari, which is actually an American film, but because so much of the dialogue was in Korean, it got classified as a foreign. Esports or gaming is really big. Starting with the Asian Games, they actually have esports as a category, competition category, and Korea won the gold medal for that. And Korea also has some amazing areas. So this is the Starfield Library, big tourist spot. Other things, this is called Korea's Rodeo Drive.
Dr. Kim, this is just a
Yes?
reminder you have 10 minutes remaining.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Okay, so looking at the past and the future, so we see that South Korea today is an economic stronghold. It's also very much democratized, but this didn't come overnight. It really was a long process. Struggles from students, labor, others. The Cold War is actually still not over in South Korea, and you feel that especially for the able-bodied young males who have to serve in the Korean military. You also see, ongoing tensions. You might have seen recent news about further escalation of tensions between the two Koreas. For the future, what I hope to see in Korea is that it's more inclusive. Korea is really on the verge of being a multicultural society because there are so many foreigners who live in Korea. A lot of marriages happen, about 10% of the marriages happen between a Korean citizen and a non-Korean citizen. So there are many biracial Korean children in Korea. So I hope that Korea moves toward being more inclusive, more equitable, what we've already seen is that South Korea is very much a leader in global health and climate change. Another thing that I didn't mention today is that South Korea has really the lowest birth rate in the whole world, followed very closely by Japan. So this year, the birth rate is expected to be 0.68 births per woman. The replenishment rate is 2.1. So South Korea is going to have a population decline as well as a aging population, because so many people in South Korea today are not having children. You know, it's perhaps they think that it's too difficult to succeed. It's too hard to raise children. So that's one of the things that South Korea is dealing with. So some photos. This is a labor protest. You'll see that it's many foreign workers known as guest workers. This is different demonstrations here about labor rights, especially for foreigners. Number of international marriages, you can see it's quite high. This is an elementary school, especially in the countryside. There's a lot more multiculturalism. Many of them, typically moms, might be foreigners. The fertility rate is actually this year expected to go to 0.68. There are also many people who go to Korea, whether it's to be English teachers or as foreign students. And so we see Korea went from this miracle on the hand and reached economic success. These are actually a little bit older numbers. I'll update them. So today it's 14th largest economy. Democratization has fallen quite a bit since 2021. What really has happened through a lot of hard work. And I think the future holds a lot ahead. So want to just have a little bit of time for any questions and answers you might have. I saw some things in the chat box. Let me see. Oh, I see a lot of questions here. Okay, so I am going to update these lecture slides, and maybe Jeannie can update that on the file. Yep, so Taxi Driver, the movie, not to be confused with Taxi Driver. Faker, yes, you did recognize him. Yes, they call it, well, it's not actually called Rodeo Drive, but they call it the Rodeo Drive of Seoul. What else? Love Minari, Leanne saying that. Okay, so any questions?
Yeah, maybe take this time to kind of let that sink in. That was a lot of information. And then share any questions. You can even unmute. So you can maybe raise your hand or just go ahead and unmute. And of course, in the chat, please.
And I will correct those errors I found. No matter how many times I look at it, I'm sure you're the same way. I don't see them until I'm actually seeing it.
And yeah, Professor Jung-Kim, actually, you do have until 10 a.m. That was my miscommunication with the intern, so sorry. So yeah, we do have time, plenty of time for Q&A.
Okay, so if not Q&A, one other thing that I like to ask is, how might you bring this into your classroom? You know, what might you talk about? You know, because I know people teach all different levels. And I think there's something you could probably bring in even, you know, to younger students. And I imagine most of your students know about BTS and other K-pop. Oh, okay, so Sharon, how long of a term does a president have? So they've been talking about changing the constitution, but for now, presidents have a single 5-year term. So it's a little bit odd in that it's not a, you know, so the National Assembly has 4-year terms, but the president has 5-year terms. So there have been talk about how they should really realign that. The other thing is with one single term, all presidents are basically, you know, just kind of, you know, lame ducks as soon as they're elected. Could you explain the causes of the increase in foreign workers in the recent decades? Oh, good question, Susan. Okay, so this actually started earlier on, and there were many Koreans who didn't want what they call in Korea the 3D occupations: dirty, dangerous, and demeaning. So things like, certain kinds of factory work, especially ones involving slaughter and the meat industry. Some of the difficult jobs like, farming, very labor intensive jobs. So foreign guest workers were coming in with visas to take on these jobs. And also there are many people who are undocumented in Korea as well. So for people from newly industrializing nations, for them to go to Korea and earn the Korean minimum wage, they can really make a lot of money to send back to their families. So there have been, at least for, I feel like for about 20, 30 years, there have been many guest workers in South Korea. There are also many Korean men who marry foreign women, and that might happen even through like an official matchmaking agency. Like there have been many Vietnamese wives coming to Korea. And so a Korean man can sign up for like a matchmaking travel or tour to Vietnam. So he'll go, he'll be with other Korean men. They'll meet a bunch of Vietnamese women. And if there's like a love match, they'll go meet her family. And then he will leave while she prepares for her fiancé visa. And one of the things that the South Korean government requires is that they also pass a Korean proficiency exam. And so while their visa is being processed, the women learn Korean in free classes. They learn Korean cooking, Korean customs. And then when their visa is processed, they will join their fiancé in Korea. There are also many other foreign brides in Korea. But one of the things is that Korean society really expects assimilation rather than acculturation. They expect the women to become Korean, to learn to speak Korean, to cook Korean food. So that hasn't quite been fair in terms of acculturation, if you're familiar with acculturation versus assimilation. But I think that's one of the things that South Korea will deal with in the future. Let's see, Luz is asking, what's the likelihood of a reunification? What is the popular view on this? I would say it depends whom you ask. Some people are very much for reunification, other people are not, or they want reunification by absorption. A lot of different ideas. The official South Korean government position is that they do not want absorption, because watching what happened when West Germany absorbed East Germany, the official South Korean response has been that they do not want absorption of North Korea. I personally think that peaceful coexistence with a two-state solution on the Korean Peninsula would, in my own opinion, be the most effective, in that, with a formal end to the Korean War, that'll change relations as well. But depending on who you ask. Professor Cho, approximate percent of foreign workers in Korea. Oh, for this year, I don't know. I don't know if Jeannie has a chance to quickly Google that and give us an answer.
Question again?
The question is the percentage of foreign workers in Korea today.
Okay.
I have a feeling that also we might need to divide that up between, say, the guest workers who are doing the, kind of more of the minimum wage jobs versus white collar foreigners who might be making a lot of money. Nareda says, you mentioned that the prime minister was to have real power. Oh, no, that was only in 1960 for a year before the coup happened. So at that time, with the second constitution, they decided that the prime minister would be the one with the real political power. Like if we look at, many countries today, where it's the prime minister who was heading the government. But that ended with a coup, Park Chung-hee's coup in 1961. Susan Lee asks another question. How is the Korean government system similar and different to that of the US? Oh, good question. Okay, so it is quite different. I mean, there's a balance of powers. However, the president doesn't have 2 terms. The president is the executive leader, but has a single 5-year term. The Korean National Assembly is not bicameral, so it's not like the US where there's the Senate and the House of Representatives. It's a single house. However, they do have 2 kinds of assembly members, those who are elected and those who get the by seats from their party. What else? There are some other differences, but I'd say in many ways, you know, in terms of the split, it's different. And then, oh, that's a Jeannie question. Yao asks, where can I find today's agenda? So I sped through those responses, but does anybody else have any other questions? We've got a little more time. How does the education system compare to the US? Oh, good question. Okay, so one of the, in a different presentation I give, I explain this a lot. So in Korea, there's elementary school for 6 years. Today, increasingly with the lower population, there's also including kindergarten, but 6 years of elementary school, 3 years of junior high school, 3 years of high school. And for people going on to a 4-year college, there is the Sunung, the Korean version of the SAT, and it takes about 7-8 hours to administer. They do it on one day in November, and it's huge. It's like a, you know, everything. It's not like the SATs where you can take it every other month, or, you know, you can take the ACTs. In Korea, this is all important. It takes all day. And for students who don't get the score to get into college, they have to wait another year to take it. So it's big. The whole country comes together. Yes, good question, Maddie. So they actually, during the English language comprehension exam, where that has to be done at the exact same time for the whole country, they actually ban flights from landing and taking off at Gimpo Airport, which is pretty much in Seoul city limits. So the whole country really comes together. Big companies stagger their work hours. Police will give escorts to students getting to school late who might miss it. I actually know someone who got lost and missed getting into the test and had to wait a whole nother year to take it again. So yeah, so it's really big, and people talk about how difficult the Korean education system is. So there's a lot of emphasis like on this the CSAT, and so people, you know, who can afford to spend a lot of money on cram schools. You might have seen dramas about cram school. There are many of them because students often go and do these. Under the previous administration, they said, you know, all of these cram schools have to close down at a certain time at night so that students will go home. But the education system is very difficult and demanding, which is why some parents in Korea choose to put their children into international schools or send them abroad to study. Carlos's question is, could you talk a little about the DMZ? Now, the DMZ has been in the news again a lot. The demilitarized zone separates North Korea from South Korea, and it is was one of the most heavily mined areas in the world. And there was some attempt to remove some of the mines, but and that depends on the relations between the two Koreas at any given time. But right now, there's a lot of tensions because relations between North and South, and North Korea said that they're going, or North Korea said they're going to not abide by a agreement that that the two Koreas had worked out. And you might have heard about North Korea sending balloons filled with trash and human waste across. And then South Koreans had also been sending balloons of propaganda and things to the north as well. So this is kind of going on. Oh, and Jeannie found a link. You can click on that. You can go to English. Okay, so Leanne also says, I got overwhelming responses from students about Jung-Kim, the first lady. How can you scaffold your students' views on research about the first president? I'd probably say, you know, kind of like to have them look at him in a very, you know, long time frame. So in terms of Syngman Rhee, you know, he was one of the big independence leaders during the colonial period. He was based in Honolulu, really rallied to get a lot of Korean Americans to support the independence movement. And also, I think earlier on in his presidency, you can also see, yeah, he was very pro-America, but he also was trying to help. And then by the time we get into, I think, the post-Korean War period, he becomes more authoritarian, more despotic. And so kind of look at different stages and to not just look at, and to try to get a balanced view of his life. I mean, he certainly lived to be very old. And so we can see that he, you know, his strengths as well as his, I don't want to call them weaknesses, but perhaps his abuses of power.